Okay, so we're talking about global health governance today, and I want to start by talking about COVID and the failures of the global pandemic response and linking them to the idea of global health governance and the shortfalls. And I've put 4 points on this slide. The first is that in the first few months of 2020, when WHO was very concerned to make sure that people that there would be equitable access to COVID technologies, even though at that stage we didn't have any vaccines, Dr. Tedros proposed we establish something called the COVID Technology Access Pool, or CTAP, and which would be a way of sharing the technology equitably in an organisation which would be partly run by WHO. Big Pharma absolutely refused to have anything to do with this and was supported by the US. In other words, they were not, even at that very early stage, they were not willing to even discuss a mechanism for sharing their technologies. Instead, we got the ACT accelerator, the Action for COVID Technologies, Access to COVID Technologies Accelerator, which included COVAX, which was directly involved in the vaccine hoarding by the rich countries. And there's two things to be said about this one. One is that it enabled vaccine hoarding, but the other is that it completely bypassed the World Health Assembly. So the ACT accelerator, which was promoted by the US and its allies, particularly the UK and the European Union, deliberately was structured outside the World Health Assembly or outside WHO, so that the international big pharma could be directly involved, so that Bill Gates could be directly involved, and that the World Health Assembly, which is where developing countries have got a voice and a vote, would not be involved. So I guess I'm giving these two examples to make us think about what is wrong with global health governance in these cases. And then the third case is about the refusal of Big Pharma, again supported by the US and its allies, to agree to the TRIPS waiver, which was first proposed in late 2020 by India and South Africa, which would which would ask the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to agree not to prosecute if people used intellectual property that they didn't have an official right to. Again, it was refused by Big Pharma, again supported by the US. Now, these three decisions during COVID really contributed to a massive imbalance in the distribution of vaccines and other technologies and treatments and so forth. And you really have to ask yourself, was that just a mistake? Or was it somehow a continuation of the old colonial mentality, which I've referred to here as coloniality, an attitude of arrogance to people who are less powerful than you? And I think we need to take seriously the idea of the arrogance of coloniality. But there's a similar story to be told in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. First of all, in terms of climate denialism, then the role of the fossil fuel lobby, which includes both the countries as well as the corporations, in fueling denialism and delay. Then there's the neglect of adaptation. This is a big issue for the Global South, is the focus of the rich countries on mitigation, so slowing down the production of carbon dioxide, and the neglect of the poor countries with regard to adaptation. And I don't think you can say that the floods in Nepal and in Philippines were directly and singularly consequent upon global warming, but we know that global warming makes those kind of disasters more likely. And so the refusal to fund adaptation in the global south is another issue for us to ask questions about. And these are really definitely health issues. If you think about the way in which migration and the displacement of people driven by global warming is a consequence of global warming, and how brutally it has been responded to by the global north, by which I include Australia, which is an honorary member of the global south. Never mind. So this idea of, I've gone back one slide. I'm now looking at the bottom dot point on this earlier slide and coming back to this idea of the arrogance of not caring about other people associated with the attitude of coloniality. Okay. So let's ask ourselves, what are we talking about here with regard to global health governance? Is it an autonomous domain of global governance? And this is the way it is often presented, that there is a thing called global health governance, which is made up of WHO and the Global Fund and Gavi and Bill Gates and USAID and the other bilateral donors and the Red Cross and Oxfam and maybe even PHM, but it's somehow separate from global governance more generally. Or shall we think about global health governance as a reflection of economic, global economic, cultural, and political governance made up of empires and armies, the World Bank and the IMF and the trade agreements, the powerful corporations, and perhaps we should include patriarchy and race and coloniality in that. So this is a big, well, it's not really a debate, it's a division in the literature about global health governance, is whether you need to think through the broader picture on the right of the slide when you're thinking about global health governance. I should have made the point earlier that we're talking about governance, not government. And this is quite an important point to make, because we don't have a global government, and we're not going to have a global government, certainly not for a long time. And that's the reason we talk about governance, which is a much more looser and more general term. We're talking about the aggregate set of forces and structures which shape governance instead of having a government. But having even made that point, there are many different ways of thinking about global governance. And I've listed 6 here. One is a focus on what is called multilateralism, which is to talk about the intergovernmental organizations like WHO, like the UN, like the World Bank. Multilateralism doesn't really say it, but it means all of the governments or most of the governments. And the assumption is that the intergovernmental organizations will make equitable, rational decisions for the betterment of people and planet. That's one perspective, it's one story. And then there's a story about multi-stakeholderism, which is sort of illustrated by the ACT accelerator, the Access to COVID Technologies accelerator, which, as I said, was structured outside WHO in order to give big pharma and philanthropy a seat at the table. This is what they say. They ask for a seat at the table. And it's a new approach to governance, which is being pushed by the corporations and by the rich countries. Then there's a story about imperialism. And imperialism can be expressed through diplomatic bullying, and this has happened a lot in terms of trade agreements and in terms of internal economic policy, but it can also reach into military intervention, and it wouldn't be too hard to tell a story about the role of imperialism in the disaster that's happening in the Middle East at the moment. Then there's a story about corporate power, which is a story about things like investment extortion. Now, what on earth do I mean by investment extortion? Basically, it's about big companies being able to say to countries which need their investment, we will only invest in your country if you give us a really easy tax deal, if you don't follow us around environment protection or labour rights. But it can go beyond investment extortion to simply the buying of and selling of politicians, and the revolving door whereby politicians move between political jobs and corporate jobs. Then there's a story about market sentiment. This is a story about how rich people generally impact on what can be done under governance by the way they spend their money, the impact that they have on exchange rates. So if rich people in Thailand, for example, sell the Thai baht quickly and buy US dollars, the Thai baht will fall and it'll lead to inflation and an economic crisis. So the role of market sentiment is another story about governance. And then there's the story about patriarchy and race, which I've touched upon. I wonder if I should stop there and see if there are people with questions. I might just stop sharing for a moment. I do have a few more slides, but I'm stopping sharing just to see whether you've got some questions or comments you'd like to make about the story I've told so far. Don't all speak at once. Am I making sense? Can I have some thumbs up or thumbs down about whether you're following what I'm trying to say?
Yes, David. It's me also from Nepal as a participant. But these terms are sometimes like difficult to catch at maybe within a short session. So it's kind of processing these kind of heavy terms for me personally, I would say, and getting through understanding of these kind of global governance. I mean, more focused towards the health. So yes, but it's still more to process. Maybe we can have more questions in the later phase of the day or other sessions. Thank you. Thank you. This was wonderful to learn.
Thank you, Ashok. Altiaro, Mutiaro, were you going to make a comment as well? You're muted.
At this point, I think it's pretty clear. Yeah, I think it's quite clear. I will ask if I have questions. Thank you.
Okay, Paul. Your hand is up, Paul.
Yeah, I'm now unmuted. Thank you, David. That was really, really good. But could you just expand a little bit on the difference between multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism? I think that might be a source of confusion for some, and it is a little bit for me as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, maybe I'll go back to sharing and I'll start with this issue that Paul's raised. The difference between multilateralism means that, well, taking WHO as an example, is that WHO is only made up of governments. The votes on the floor of the World Health Assembly are only by governments, and almost all governments in the world, not all, but almost all. And if other people like PHM or Pfizer or Royal Dutch Shell want to have a say, or let's say, Cadbury's chocolates want to have a say in government, they have to go through the structures of WHO. The difference between that and multi-stakeholderism is that you leave aside the structures of intergovernmental decision making and you make space for the private corporations and for Bill Gates to have a seat at the table. So what you're now saying is that that we need to focus on stakeholders rather than sovereign governments. And this is a very strong discourse currently taking place around not just a discourse, but it's a pressure taking place. And the example of the ACT accelerator and COVAX illustrates this well. Let me move on. Okay, I've talked about COVID and I've talked about climate change, and I've talked about big pharma and effectively big fossil fuel being oil and coal. But it's also important to understand that the big pharma companies and the big fossil fuel companies in today's world are owned by big finance. Oops, a day. Big finance here being the big banks, the big insurance companies, the hedge funds, the pension funds, and the private wealth funds. And these huge companies with huge amounts of money at their disposal, it's not all theirs, but it's borrowed money or lent money, buy and sell the companies who we call big pharma and the companies, the big oil and big coal companies. And the wealth of the richest people in the world comes from the profit and the capital gains from the corporations being bought and sold by big finance. So there's a direct link here between the ownership of big pharma, big fossil, big food, and the distribution of wealth and the growing economic inequality, but within countries as well as between countries. But it's also structured around governance decision making. So in pharma, the profits from pharma are actually propped up by the monopoly status of pharmaceuticals based on extreme intellectual property rights. And those intellectual property rights have been imposed by imperial power. Prior to 1994, this is so recent, prior to 1994, we did not have anything like the intellectual property laws that we now have through the TRIPS agreement. And it is a consequence of those intellectual property laws that pharma is able to make bigger profits than any other sector of the economy and pay bigger dividends to the owners of pharma than any other sector, bigger profits. And the same thing's happening with fossil fuel, which is propped up by tax subsidies and military force. So the link I'm making here is between what I started with, which was about bad decisions in relation to COVID or in relation to global warming, the link between them and the way in which big pharma and big fossil fuel are owned, and then the way in which governance works, which is the point I'm really wanting to get to, that if you go back to this question, is global health governance an autonomous domain made up of WHO and the Global Fund and Bill Gates, or is it a subdomain of economic and cultural and political governance? It's clear that I'm arguing that it's the latter, and it doesn't make sense to talk about global health governance as if it is isolated from the broader picture. Okay, now we also, let me talk a little bit about liberal democracy. It's important to remember that this word liberalism or liberal or liberalism is a really messy word. It is used in such different ways. But one story about liberalism is that it comes back from the early the 1500s, 1600s, when the early development of capitalism in Europe was struggling against the church and against kings who had a total control of commerce. And liberalism, coming at that time, meant freedom of commerce from the Pope and the kings, freedom for commerce. And this is still the case, that contemporary liberalism is the freedom of capital to invest wherever it wants. And the progressive liberalisation of global trade and of global finance is about the freedom to invest in whatever, wherever, whenever, which means that liberal democracy, which is sold to us as a wonderful modern invention, is actually talks about popular sovereignty, about elections and governments over everything except the investment decisions which shape our future. So when we're talking about governance and the bigger picture of governance, it's important to recognize that capitalism as an economic system based on the freedom to invest, not the freedom of speech or the freedom of movement, but the freedom to invest, is a major determinant, shaper of global governance. It's part of the context of the way in which global governance works. So just to sum up, I've highlighted I want to highlight two key dynamics in terms of contemporary capitalism, and two defining features of imperialism, which I have talked about in the PHM paper, which was listed for discussion. Maybe if you didn't read it, it doesn't really matter. But I've picked out some pictures from that paper to talk about briefly now in terms of the way in which modern capitalism works. This slide is called the crisis of overproduction, and it starts up here in the right-hand corner with labour and capital struggling for a share of surplus value. Will it go to wages or to profit? And capital has defeated labour in the high-income countries because of its ability to shift work, production, to the low-wage countries. And so productive capacity has exploded through access to cheap labour, continuing replacement of labour by fossil energy and technology, and through global markets, which means that consumption growth, which depends upon wages so that households can buy stuff, doesn't grow fast enough to consume all the things that increased production can produce. So corporations maintain their profit by achieving global monopolies, so they don't have to compete on price, by being protected by imperial power and through monopolies based on intellectual property. This is a complex slide, and I think I might cut to the chase and I invite you to read it more carefully at a later time, because it's getting more complicated as I go. But just to draw your attention to what we could call the contradictions of capitalism in the present period and the way in which these work. And the second slide here is about what's called financialization, that over the last 30 years, the financial sector, both in the rich north and in the global south, has expanded hugely. And this is because profits are being redirected. Instead of being directed into new investment, they're being directed into the financial sector. So this is what gave us the financial crisis of 2009. It's a complicated story, but it's worth working on. Okay, I want to give you two slides about imperialism. The definition of imperialism is unequal power relations which enable unequal exchange relations. And this is quite central to the gap between the global south and the global north. So unequal power relations includes war, ideological pressures, the imperial control of intergovernmental organizations, the northern dominance of research and development, corporate privilege, and debt. There's other aspects of that as well. So that's about unequal power relations between the imperial countries and the smaller countries, like down in the right-hand corner. And unequal power relations enables unequal exchange relations, which means that in trade, the global south continues to trade and in general continues to lose. The benefit of that trade selectively goes to the global north. Hence these red arrows which all point to the global north. And the unequal exchange relations are embedded in trade liberalisation, agricultural protection of the north, the difference in labour, in wages between different countries, financial liberalisation, extractivism, the theft of genetic resources, and so on and so on. Now, I might stop here. I will send you a copy of this presentation, but I'm not suggesting that you should somehow be ready to sort of explain this to somebody else. What I'm hoping to do is to make you excited by the difficulty of it, and that you might go back and read these papers and study it a little bit further forward. But the bottom line for today is that we're talking about global health governance, and the relationships we've been talking about in this presentation are essential to understanding global health governance. Right, finished. Stop. If you've got any questions,